Hello and welcome to the show. We are on Forza 7 today, going to be doing an investigation into another car part and how it will affect performance of a race vehicle. Today, focusing on the roll cage. Now, you will see these in all modern race cars, rally cars, in one guise or another. Sometimes it can be a real pain in the arse with obstructing the view out of the windscreen, but yeah, in one form or another, you will find these in modern racing vehicles. Something that I will tend to always stick in the race cars that I build for whatever class, whatever it might be. Roll cage will tend to be a go-to part that I will want in my car. Something that has often been questioned. I've had various people asking about whether it's really worth adding them into the vehicle, so that is what I set out to answer. Of course, when it comes to real racing, the primary purpose for the roll cage is safety. You have this incredibly strong metal structure inside the bodywork of the car. It is an extra layer of protection for the driver or the occupants of the car, and they are very efficient at protecting the driver. It's making the car incredibly strong. That's why you see people, or one of the many reasons why you see drivers able to get out of absolutely massive wrecks. But of course, when it comes to a game, safety is hardly of importance. It doesn't matter if your car is safe when you're racing it in a video game. The benefit that you get, in theory, is that by having these roll cages in the car, by having all of this extra metal structure around, you make the vehicle stiffer. With a stiffer chassis of the car, you will perhaps be able to get a little bit more grip, you'll be able to get a little bit more in the way of corner speed, and theoretically, over the course of the lap, be able to go faster. But it does come at a cost. When we are looking at this as a pure exercise in a game, if you like, the cost of adding a roll cage is weight. They can weigh anything, depending on the size of the car, from about £100 up to, I think, about £250, maybe even higher for some of the really big cars. So they are a fair amount of weight to worry about. Let's not forget, when it comes to real-world racing in the early days, when sort of roll cages were starting to come in as a mandatory thing, there were race teams, I can't remember where I heard this, but there were race teams that would try and cheat. They would make up like fake roll cages out of foam and so on to try and keep weight down, but have it look the part so it would pass inspection and so on. So there is some validity, if you like, to all of this, which is why we had to go off and do a little bit of an investigation. Although first I wanted to make a point of to see just how much of a difference a roll cage would make in a car, well, like this Ford Fairlane. Of course, in a Ferrari GT race car, taking a roll cage out, so you're not going to notice a huge difference visually. But when you have a car like this, the chances are you would, or at least that was my hope. The Fairlane is notoriously wobbly. Notoriously wobbly indeed. This is the car being driven with no roll cage whatsoever. Of course, not all of this wobbling through the corners is caused by the chassis, caused by the lack of a roll cage. A lot of it is down to the suspension and the suspension settings and so on. This car designed to be a drag car, not exactly designed to be going around corners, but I figured if anything was going to be able to show you visually the difference a roll cage could make, it was going to be a vehicle like this one. So the car completely stock. The only difference in this run is the roll cage. It's still, of course, going to wobble its way through the corners. It's still going to dive a lot under brakes. It's still going to want to go up on its side through the turns. But note as we go around the corners how much the front wheels are now lifting off the ground. By having the chassis an awful lot stiffer, by fitting that roll cage, rather than have the car wobble and essentially, I guess, have the chassis twist to almost keep one of the wheels on the ground, now it doesn't. Now, as it goes around a corner, it lifts one of the front wheels up into the air. I didn't quite realise, perhaps expect it to be so evident, so obvious when you have the two against one another. Now, this might not actually necessarily make the Fairlane easier to drive in this state. It does add an awful lot of PI. It was 20 PI there or thereabouts when you put the roll cage in this car. But yeah, it does have the front wheel massively wiggling around in the air. I took two pictures. This will come into the first corner here at Lime Rock. On the left is the car without a roll cage. On the right is the car with a roll cage. That's a huge difference. And remember, not touch the suspension. The actual sort of suspension, springs, shocks, etc. not being altered whatsoever. They're all on the car's completely standard ones. That is the difference. That is the difference that you would have with running a roll cage and without. Of course, you'd never build the car in that manner. The first thing, if I was building this car to use it, the first thing I would do would be change the suspension. Because, yeah, you can't have the car wobbling around like this. But, as a demonstration, as an exercise in, quite showing the difference that single part can do. It's a huge difference, massive difference. If you look at not just the wheel sticking up in the air, but how much the front suspension isn't compressing on the left-hand side as it's going through that corner, because it's trying to, the roll cage is trying desperately to keep all the chassis together. It was really interesting. I wasn't expecting such a marked visual difference. I was hoping for some, but maybe not quite that much. Anyway, with the fair lane making for an interesting spectacle, it was off to the sort of main part of the test. I was going to use 3 vehicles, and as ever with these, try and use 3 as different vehicles as I could get, and as different age as well, because that would kind of be quite an important part, because at the end of the day we're looking at kind of how the roll cage is almost affecting the chassis and the handling. Cars like this Williams Clio, for example, had an incredible chassis at the time. In fact, it's a great car to drive even now, but it is getting relatively old. While it was brilliant for the time, they simply didn't have the technology. Now, these cars are all built up to A class. Again, we're going, I say A class, probably shouldn't phrase it better than that. They're built to, well, in this case, C class. They're built to different classes between them, again, to try and get some variety between the 3 vehicles and see how that would affect it. Yeah, the Clio here, built to C. Some people ask, well, why am I not just putting a roll cage in, or, not having a roll cage and seeing how that affects the time? Because that's not how you build a car. You don't build a car to go racing in that manner. You're building the car to a specific class, or perhaps to a specific set of restrictions. So you're going to be having other parts at play as well. I've built these vehicles as if I was going to be running them in their specific class. So I built this as I would be building an overall C-class car. I haven't specialised it to run at at a cornering circuit or at a straight line speed circuit. I've built it as an overall build, and the only slight difference is the roll cage, because of course the roll cage will affect the PI of the vehicle. In the case of the Clio, it added 10 PI, not as much as the Fairlane. I was very surprised to see it adding as much PI onto what is a relatively good handling car, and with 10 PI difference, that meant that we lost 8 horsepower by adding in the roll cage. That's a fair loss for a car like the Williams Clio. Of course, we had to have a big classic muscle car as one of our vehicles. The Dodge Challenger would fit the bill, this one being built to C-Class. Of course, first thing I did with the vehicle was to stick it on some racing suspension. So no, you're not going to see as visibly sort of marked distinction between the vehicle with a roll cage and without, because it has got some proper racing suspension on the car. However, that roll cage is still going to make a difference, because let's face it, this is a rather old chassis. This is a 60s chassis that you've got. Actually, maybe just be a 70s. I can't remember what year Challenger they have in the game. Either way, it's a very, very old chassis, an awful lot of old technology in a car like this one. And this is the sort of vehicle that you would expect would need a roll cage the most. Interestingly, as I said, the Renault Clio added an awful lot of PI. With the Challenger, it added 9 PI, which meant that when you took the roll cage out of the car, keeping it in B class, I could add on 9 horsepower. Now, when I was doing these builds, I was only adding power as the way to make up the PI of the vehicle, rather than fiddling around with any other ways. And the second of the circuits that I was going to use for the measuring was Daytona. This layout of Daytona being, well, an awful lot of straights. Awful lot of straights around here. This is a very speed-orientated circuit, whereas the Road Atlanta track, the Road Atlanta short circuit that I was using, a more handling-orientated, perhaps not the craziest handling-orientated, but certainly a lot more handling-orientated around there, a lot of fast corners. One of the biggest marked differences between the Challenger running a roll cage over not running a roll cage, much better under brakes. it felt much more secure under brakes. Wasn't quite what I was expecting, but yeah, while it was a bit better through the corners, under brakes it really did feel a considerably nicer car. Our final vehicle, something modern, the Audi TT. This one built up to A-Class. Now, the difficulty with some of the modern vehicles is that, well, okay, the chassis is going to be considerably better to begin with, and often a lot of these sports cars that we have in Forza come with at least partially installed roll cages. For both the Challenger and the Clio, I installed the third tier of roll cage upgrade, basically the maximum I could do with the roll cage. I did exactly the same with the Audi TT. The base car itself already came with essentially the first stage of the roll cage added. Now, what this means for the vehicle, unlike the other two cars, the weight of the roll cage being added to the Audi meant that it lost PI. It lost 3 PI in all of this. Now, that would perhaps suggest that the roll cage isn't really making much difference to the handling, that the basic chassis is good enough that the roll cage doesn't necessarily matter. But by losing that 3 PI, I could gain 6 horsepower. So, yeah, the car is going to be heavier by having the roll cage, but I only had to do a couple of stages of roll cage upgrade, which means it was less than £100 added to this car. And while, you know, the basic chassis is going to be good, still going to be better. When you put the roll cage, it's still going to have a stiffer chassis at the end of it by putting in that roll cage. So, yeah, we gained horsepower in the case of the Audi. And while of course I can't test every single possible combination, in general that is the way that it tends to go. The more modern car, the better handling car you have to begin with, chances are you're going to lose PI by installing a roll cage, which means that you're going to be able to compensate for that weight by adding power, or maybe taking weight off in a different manner. Overall, when we come to the times for the various vehicles, the Audi TT went quicker with the roll cage installed at both circuits, at both Daytona and at Road Atlanta. The TT would go faster. It didn't make a huge difference though. We're only talking a couple of tenths at Road Atlanta, 3 tenths at Daytona. Not vast differences, but it went quicker both times. With the Williams Clio, it was faster at Road Atlanta, again by about 4 tenths of a second. Did lose out at Daytona around 6 tenths of a second. Perhaps I'm not so surprised to see those differences, because 8 horsepower to what is a relatively low-powered car, that's quite a big gain. You have 8 horsepower and you have the car lighter. That's a decent-sized gain to help it down the very, very long straights there at Daytona. Whereas at the more handling-orientated circuit, Road Atlanta, that power less important and it can corner better. The Challenger with the biggest differences in lap time, 8 tenths of a second faster with a roll cage at Road Atlanta. Not at all surprised, you know, that's the car that you would expect to need a roll cage the most, and as I said, it felt a lot more secure under brakes and generally nicer to drive with that cage installed. At Daytona, it did go a little bit slower, 4 tenths of a second down. It's 4 tenths of a second, of course, let's not forget, a much longer circuit. Extra power is going to come in handy at a track like Daytona. So, for conclusions in all of this, I would stick very much with putting a full roll cage in all of my cars. In vehicles like the TT, in the modern cars that you would perhaps argue don't necessarily need a roll cage, chances are you're going to be losing PI points that you can then use in another area of the car, and that will negate any hindrance almost of the weight, and you're going to still be getting the chassis stiffer, you're going to still be getting the car driving better. And certainly when it comes to the classic cars, you're going to be wanting a roll cage for, well, some sort of control. Certainly with things like this Fiat 8V, things like the Ford Fairlane, you'll notice a very, very, very big difference with driving them. Yeah, there are slight downsides. Of course, you will be spending a fair amount of PI points on some of these vehicles to get the roll cage fitted. But if you are building a car, you know, to run at Daytona, well, I'll take some PI points out elsewhere to get that extra power. One slight thing to note, of course, when it comes to running the cars in the wet, sometimes having a very, very stiff car can have scary consequences, as I found out with this Fiat. This Fiat likes going up on 2 wheels everywhere everywhere it ever races. You'll see in upcoming versus the community just how that goes. Yeah, you know, that's a small downside of the interesting Forza physics when it comes to cars hitting some big curbs. But honestly, from all of this, I would, yeah, recommend running with that full roll cage. Yeah, if you are using an overall build car, maybe you'll lose a little bit of time when it comes to a real high-powered circuit, but everywhere else it is going to be a much nicer to drive car. And if you are building, you know, a car that you want to tackle that high-speed circuit, I would change the build elsewhere. I would change maybe tyre widths or find something else that I would change, because I would really want to quite keep that roll cage in the car. That, though, is going to be it for this video. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.